I've recently finished reading Brian Michael Bendis' run on Daredevil, the first trade of which I've already reviewed, and I was going to spend a little bit of time reviewing trades 2 and 3, or books 2 and 3. Now, this story arc is available in, I think, about a dozen trade paperbacks. However, the ones that I've bought that I showed the first of in the previous video are the sort of Ultimate Collections, which are quite big, thick trade paperbacks, and there's 3 in total collecting Brian Michael Bendis' complete run, along with artwork by Alex Maleev. So there's book 2 and there's book 3. It's really in these 2 books that Brian Michael Bendis really sort of settles into his groove in Daredevil, in my opinion, and I do feel that about the halfway point in book 2 it really takes a massive jump up in quality. That's not to say that what's come before was bad, because it's not. It's great, it's all great stuff, but it sort of begins to get into classic territory about halfway through book 2. So basically, book 2 starts pretty much where the first book left off. And basically, in the Kingpin's absence from Hell's Kitchen, there's a character known as the Owl who's trying to take his place. So for the first few issues, Daredevil has to deal with the Owl. And this is something that I believe the Owl's been sort of in Daredevil before. I don't think I've actually read any Daredevil that starred the Owl, but he's quite an interesting villain in as much as he's a little bit rubbish, and he's not a very good sort of leader or gang boss, and that's sort of demonstrated by his sort of final physical confrontation with Daredevil, which, you know, doesn't, as you can imagine, doesn't last very long because the Owl's a little bit pathetic. But basically what the Owl is up to is using his own blood to create a new drug that's sort of infesting the streets of Hell's Kitchen, and Daredevil's had enough and basically goes after him. And meanwhile, we're introduced to a new love interest for Matt Murdock called Milla Donovan, who is a young blind girl who he saves from a sort of speeding truck that nearly hits her. She's introduced, and to be honest, like straight away, I sort of really liked her character. You know, I was reading Milla's dialogue and just thinking, you know, she seems like a really sort of likeable person, and the sort of woman that, you know, would complement Matt Murdock. But Brian Michael Bendis is smart enough to give her own voice. You know, she's not a sort of two-dimensional love interest. He does go some way to give her own voice. So I really like the relationship between the two of them, which goes to some very interesting places over the course of the rest of the run. So once the Owl's storyline is wrapped up, we then deal with the return of the Kingpin and the ramifications that has on Matt Murdock's current predicament as being outed as Daredevil, which is sort of the overall theme in the whole run is basically Matt Murdock's secret identity, Daredevil's secret identity, being revealed to the world. But what they do in this run is essentially keep it sort of not necessarily under wraps, but at no point is it, you know, made abundantly clear to the public that Matt Murdock is Daredevil, but that's the sort of risk throughout the whole thing. At any given moment, you know, this house of cards may come tumbling down, and he'll be revealed as Daredevil. The, you know, rumour is that Matt Murdock is Daredevil, and he's sort of bombarded by press throughout the whole story. But he's trying his best to sort of keep it under wraps. So we then have the return of the Kingpin, who basically comes and wants his territory back, and finds that his sort of lieutenants and his wife have disbanded his empire, and needless to say, he's not very happy about it. So that's another storyline, and not to go into too much detail with how the Kingpin deals with that, but it basically winds up, as you can imagine, in a confrontation, and this is still all in book 2, between Daredevil and the Kingpin. And following that confrontation, and I won't reveal how it ends, this is sort of a minor spoiler, but the Daredevil goes on to declare himself as Kingpin of Hell's Kitchen. Basically, you know, says to the people of Hell's Kitchen, you know, look, I'm sick of trying to protect you and save you. You now are going to sort of do my bidding. And, you know, he's not gone evil or anything. He's just said, look, I'm sick of trying to protect you, and I'm just going to tell you what to do. And if you try and deal drugs or steal on my streets, then you'll have me to answer to. And that actually sees a sort of dramatic fall in the crime rate, because after the issue where he declares himself Kingpin, we then jump forward, I believe, 12 months into the future, where Ben Urich is tasked with tracking Matt down. This is where basically the book, for me, the run takes a massive jump up in terms of what it's trying to do, and starts to transcend sort of what comics normally do, because it sort of thematically and narratively expands and takes these types of characters to the natural conclusion, because, you know, Daredevil's come to the realisation that no matter what he does, no matter how many bad guys he beats up, you know, there are always going to be more take the place. So he puts himself in the position of Kingpin, so that he can essentially rule Hell's Kitchen and no longer have to sort of deal with the sort of low-level hoods, because everybody's answering to him anyway. So it's really interesting, and you do have cameos, and this is what I love about Brian Michael Bendis' run as well. He has cameos from other Marvel characters and other Marvel heroes that don't feel forced. Like you have Luke Cage, Doctor Strange, Reed Richards and Peter Parker turn up and basically tell Matt, you've gone too far, you've crossed a line that, you know, you shouldn't have crossed. We can't cross it, you know, in being responsible heroes, we can't do what you're doing. And they basically, you know, say to him, and it's right, you know, in the context of the story, that if you basically rule Hell's Kitchen and stamp out all crime's just going to move elsewhere, and they're going to have to move with it. You know, if they eventually make New York City a crime-free city, crime's just going to move to Philadelphia, and all the heroes will have to move to Philadelphia to fight crime. So I really like the fact that Brian Michael Bendis sort of looks at the ramifications of his potential plot points. So that was very interesting. I also like the fact that it almost takes on a sort of mystery feel at this point in the book, because, like I said, it jumps forward 12 months, and, you know, the exact circumstances of Matt Murdock becoming the sort of leader of Hell's Kitchen, or Daredevil becoming the leader of Hell's Kitchen, he's very sort of murky, and you're not quite sure what happened. And through a series of flashbacks and stories and sort of second-hand information, you get to see basically what happened. And needless to say, once Matt Murdock declared himself, or once Daredevil rather declared himself as leader of Hell's Kitchen, you know, you had rival gangs and whatnot trying to come and muscle in on his territory. There's a magnificent issue where he's attacked by about 150 Yakuza fighters with swords and stuff, and Matt Murdock, needless to say, lays waste. It establishes very firmly that, you know, Daredevil is one of the absolute coffin nails of the Marvel Universe. Like, he's one of the characters that you do not mess with. So it goes into that. It also introduces a character that I found really interesting, and I hope sort of crops up in other Marvel stories, a character called the Night Nurse, who basically, when a hero gets injured and they can't go to a general hospital, she takes care of him and nurses him back to health, and that's a really interesting idea. I love the fact, and this is something that J. Michael Straczynski did in his Amazing Spider-Man run, something similar. He introduced a character that designs all the superhero suits. Brian Michael Bendis introduces a character who nurses them back to health. I like the idea of sort of secretive, normal people helping the heroes sort of behind the scenes. I think that's a really good idea, and quite, I like the idea that there's, you know, some good, noble people out there willing to help. Anyway, that's besides the point, but another, you know, aspect of it I really, really liked. So it goes into that plot line, and I won't spoil how it all sort of wraps up and develops, but the sort of final mini-arc is Natasha Romanoff, Black Widow, is essentially caught in a game of politics and is traded almost with a foreign diplomacy because she's committed crimes in that country, and, you know, she's sort of given up by the government, and she has assassins after her, and because she knows that there's so much press attention around Matt Murdock, who's, you know, is he or isn't he Daredevil, she goes and basically hangs out with Matt for a while and hides in plain sight where she could be safe. So I won't spoil how that resolves itself, but that's the final arc in book 2. We then move on to book 3. Book 3, I have to say, is very strong, and it has some quite interesting ideas. Now, the first sort of arc in book 3 is about a villain who, well, I say a villain, like a gangster, who sort of Matt Murdock dealt with in his early career, comes back to Hell's Kitchen as an old man, having seen in prison the newspaper articles talking about Matt Murdock potentially being Daredevil, and says, you know, now that I know who Daredevil is, and he actually had run-ins with Matt Murdock as a lawyer back in the day, he's going to go and get him. So the first few issues of book 3 basically deal with that, and again, that's another sort of natural, organic conclusion and ramification of Matt Murdock being outed as Daredevil. It's like, well, people that you've crossed in the past are going to see that you're Daredevil and come after you, and it really deals with that. And I have to say that that storyline is the closest that Matt has come to actually being completely revealed as Daredevil. What I wanted to show about this, though, is this sort of mini-arc takes place over different time periods. It has flashbacks and present day. The present day stuff is the normal artwork drawn by Alex Maleev, as you can see there. The stuff that takes place in the, I can't remember which decade it is, I want to say like the 20s or 30s, is actually drawn in black and white. And it has a much more sketch feel to it. And the stuff that takes place sort of later on, once Daredevil's on the scene and during his early career, has that sort of classic comic book printing style, like the sort of dot printer there. It looks like a sort of period comic book. So all the stuff that takes place in Daredevil's early career is drawn in that style. And it's a very sort of interesting aesthetic, in as much as it's almost meta in that, you know, dependent on what time period the action takes place in, depends on how the comic's been drawn and printed, and I just thought that was really interesting. So that's basically the first plot line of book 3. We then have a, I believe, 5-part mini-arc called Decalogue, which is about a community support group that's put up for people who have been affected in some way by Daredevil's presence in Hell's Kitchen. And each issue goes into, you know, a different person in this support group telling their story about how they've either had a run-in or been affected by Daredevil. That, I have to say, is one of the strongest mini-arcs in the whole run for me, and has a twist ending that I just thought was brilliant. Like, I was reading it and I honestly didn't see it coming. I thought, oh god, that's so cool. So there's that as well. And the final sort of big arc in this run on Daredevil is Kingpin basically attempting to strike a deal with the FBI, saying that he will once and for all give up irrefutable proof that Matt Murdock is Daredevil in exchange for a deal and immunity against charges brought against him as Kingpin of crime. So that deals with that, and that basically ties up Brian Michael Bendis' run. Now, I won't reveal how the run ends, but it basically ends with the most sort of... It couldn't have ended any other way, given what's come before. It ends in a situation where you think, how can they possibly, because it messes with the status quo of Daredevil so much, how can they possibly continue this? And I must admit, this run is carried on by, or the next run rather, is by Ed Brubaker, who's famous for doing Captain America. He went on to write Daredevil and did 3 big trades as well. And I thought, God, you know, I wouldn't want to be in Ed Brubaker's shoes following this run, because it's a difficult place to start. But it turns out I was reading an interview with Brian Michael Bendis where Ed Brubaker was, you know, sort of instrumental in coming up with the ending for this, because he wanted a challenge in writing his own. So I thought that was really cool. I haven't read any of Brubaker's yet because Volume 1 hasn't arrived yet, but I do. I've got Volume 2 and 3 of Brubaker's on the shelf, and I will be reading those, because Brian Michael Bendis is so good. It's just like, I have to continue reading Daredevil, because it is a really great run, and it's one of the best, to be honest, comic runs in general I think I've read in a long, long time. It does feel like everything in here, you know, is a product of a sort of overall plan that Brian Michael Bendis had. You know, he's a really talented guy. I love his dialogue. His character work's really good. I like the fact that not all the characters are likeable all of the time. The mini-arcs, you know, feel self-contained to a certain extent, but tie into the overall plot really well. He's just a really talented guy. It does feel like, you know, this is where it was sort of meant to end. I mean, essentially, you know, the run culminates in a big punch-up, a street-level punch-up, you know, and it's got lots of Daredevil characters, you know, Daredevil himself, Elektra, Bullseye, they're all involved, Kingpin. It has the most natural ending possible. for this type of story. It's just really, really great, and the artwork is consistently brilliant throughout. Alex Maleev's artwork really suits Daredevil. It's got that very gritty feel to it. Like I say, I don't want to ruin like where the story ends, but it does feel like a status quo shattering run. There is a great sort of alternate flash forward towards the end as well, where Matt Murdock, you know, imagines how if this ending goes a different way, you know, what would happen to him, which I thought was really great, and sort of reminded me, and I don't know what came first, but it reminded me of the end of the Edward Norton movie 25th Hour, which was great. So overall, the run is brilliant. It really is. I honestly don't think I have really any criticisms. I mean, I know that people, and I've mentioned this before, the first arc in the first book, you know, felt out of place because it was so different to what came after it. But I just think it's evident that Brian Michael Bendis has a great affection for the character of Daredevil. I know that he's written a sort of one-shot book set in the future, you know, Daredevil End of Days, which I've not read but plan to at some point in the future. But I have to say that it is probably the strongest run on Daredevil I've read since Frank Miller's. I preferred it to Kevin Smith's Guardian Devil, which I know a lot of people hold quite dear to their hearts or whatever, and it is a good book, but I have to say that this feels like a much more sort of accomplished and well thought out run. So I'm looking forward to reading Ed Brubaker's and seeing where he takes the character. I would definitely recommend you pick these up. Like I say, here's book 2, here's book 3. It's definitely worth investing. If you don't already have the sort of any of the smaller trade paperbacks, get these Ultimate collections because they're definitely worth the investment. It's a really enjoyable run. So I will be reading and reviewing Ed Brubaker's Daredevil at some point in the future. I hope you've enjoyed hearing my thoughts on Brian Michael Bendis' run on Daredevil, and please leave your thoughts in the comments and stuff, and try to avoid sort of major spoilers. I mean, I imagine a lot of people watching this may have already read it because this run is a few years old now, but please try and avoid spoilers. But I'd be interested to hear what you guys think. I know that a couple of you commented on the first video of my review of book 1 and said, you know, you were tempted to go and pick up this run. If you did, please let me know. I'd be glad. I'll be happy to sort of hear what you thought, and if you went and picked it up off the back of the previous video. So thanks very much for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and like this video and whatnot, and share it and stuff. I could really use the viewers. Thanks very much, guys, and I'll catch you in the next video.